Welcome csc230 class to EX5 Jumbotron responsive, and the reason we're calling it Jumbotron is because we're going to base it on this layout, which is called Jumbotron, actually from Twitter Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a framework that's used to create responsive web pages, and it's a framework meaning that you have to link to their code and link to their files in JavaScript in order to have everything work responsively. They have rows and columns set up. They have breakpoints set up. If you resize this, you can see what happens here. They have kind of a large size, and then they have kind of a medium size. You can see it just changes a little bit from large to medium, and then as you go smaller, eventually it's going to get to a small size, and it's going to turn into one column. You can see it lost the 3 columns and went to 1 column, and then eventually as you go to extra small, I think they call it, they lose kind of what's up here, which they had kind of input bars, but we're going to put navigation buttons up here. But you can see we get what's called the Hamburger Menu, this little 3-line kind of icon here. If you click on that, it'll open up a menu. They call that a hamburger icon, and we're going to use that. We could use that created out of CSS instead of using an image, although we could use an image. Now some of the things we're going to change here, we're going to put just like a logo or a company name up here. We're not going to use these input boxes right away. We'll just kind of put a navigation bar to start. So we'll do that, and then we may put a background picture in here. We may put some pictures here, and I'll even show you an example that we'll be working on. Here's a version done in Cloud 9. Now this is kind of what we'll be working on, and the colors, it's a little bit different, and you can see the company names here. We have some navigation buttons over here that change when you roll over them. Also here there's a button that changes when you hover over it. And there's buttons down here that kind of change when you hover them. Now they don't go anywhere yet, but this is the layout that we're going to work on, and this is just the first stage of it. We didn't put any images in yet, we didn't put any icons or anything up here, and we didn't make it responsive yet, although to start it's pretty responsive. If you resize this, if you start making the window smaller, you can see the 3 columns kind of get gradually narrower because they're set up with percentages. And as you eventually get smaller, they'll just kind of bump because they're floats right now. And if it gets too small, you can see they'll float, and one of the columns will have to get bumped to the next line, which is okay. But we don't want to have like a big gap like this, so we'll probably do it so that it becomes 2 columns for a little while. So we're probably going to change our breakpoints. We'll probably have like kind of a large breakpoint like this, which is kind of like the medium on Bootstrap. And then as we get smaller, what we'll probably do is get to a point and we'll have 2 columns. And then finally we'll have kind of a 3rd breakpoint where we get small enough, and you can see where these navigation buttons are getting close to the company name. What we'll probably do is have it change to the hamburger icon there so that we could click on here and have these navigation buttons kind of show up down below, so that if it gets to this small, you know, eventually our goal is if it's viewing on a phone, we could click on the hamburger button and we'll see our navigation buttons down here. So that's what we're going to work on, and this is kind of just the first stage of it, and we're going to do it from scratch. We're going to type all our HTML and all our CSS, and I'll give you some hints that we can do when we work in Cloud 9. We're going to use something called Emmet that'll help us type things a little bit faster, so you won't have to type as much, so that'll be helpful. And we'll probably start off by doing, I'll just show you an example here. This is the HTML that's here. So we are going to do it with HTML and a separate CSS file. So this is our HTML file, and then there's a separate CSS file. And what I have so far goes down, they're kind of broken up in sections. So we kind of have it global styles, meaning there's styles that are going to affect kind of the whole layout that all parts of the layout will use. And then there's specific areas like the header, there's an area called Jumbotron, there's an area called main columns, and there's an area called footer, which you can tell by looking at this. This is the header area that has a nav bar. This is what we call the Jumbotron area, and again that's from Twitter Bootstrap. We'll call this the main columns area, and then this we'll call the footer. We won't call it the footer, it is the footer, but we'll be using a lot of class names when we do this as well. You'll have a link so you can kind of look at the Bootstrap kind of sample. That'll help a little bit, but I'll kind of talk you through doing everything else. Other things to help us as we do this. Eventually we're going to use this through something called Css Grid. We're not going to make it a Bootstrap site because we don't want to have to link to an external framework. I'd rather have you kind of use native CSS to start. And we're going to do this straight CSS right away. We're going to use floats, so we're going to do it kind of the old school way. And then we're going to work into something called Css Grid. Just to show you what Bootstrap does real quick, I'll just run the Bootstrap, and all this stuff is under W3 School, so we could use this for a lot of resources. But if you go to Bootstrap, and just to see the way what they do is they use a 12-column setup, and then you basically specify. It's almost like using tables in a way, except you're using CSS. But it's kind of a table setup. And here's their classes. They're large, medium, small, extra small, and we'll change these breakpoints a little bit. So this is Bootstrap, and again, when you use Bootstrap, you have to kind of link to the CDN. So you actually link to their CSS and their jQuery and their JavaScript. So we're not going to be doing that. We're going to be writing all our own CSS, and eventually we're going to be using something, and I'll show you up here too. If you scroll down, there's something called Css Grid, and here's Css Grid, and this is very similar, except it's not a framework. We're actually just going to be using CSS, and it's actually part of CSS3, so it's all built into CSS, so it's all very native. It does not work on some older browsers, so that's the only caveat, but it's kind of the wave of the future. I think this will be really popular. It's popular already, but it'll get really popular, I think, for laying out responsive web pages, and not having to do floats all the time. It's another kind of setup like that. So we're going to use CSS Grid eventually. We're going to do that next, but we're going to start it off doing it pretty much manually, just to make sure you're very comfortable with writing your classes, writing your HTML, writing everything, and making everything responsive. And then we'll use this as a way to kind of make it easier. So this will be a site that we'll just keep building on as we go. And when we need to learn how to do things, there's a lot of things in W3 Schools, as far as icon bars, as far as buttons, as far as navigation bars at the top that stay there. So whenever we need to know how to do some kind of little thing in it, we'll have access to places all in here to go do that. So we'll be able to copy some code, so you don't have to be completely blank about doing that, or be like, wow, how did he do that? We could just get some stuff out of here when we need to do it, when we need to style a button, when we need to style something like this. If we need to style a navigation bar at the top that when it gets smaller, it turns into a hamburger button. Well, here we have code to do that. That'll help us learn how to do that. So we can use W3 Schools as a big resource. And also another resource is Traversy Media, is where I found that web development website for 2018, and he has some nice videos on CSS Grid, which I've been watching too. So I'm going to incorporate some of that CSS Grid from Traversy Media into here. So we'll kind of do a little combination of an exercise here, but again, this is what we're going to be kind of working with to start for the first part of this. And then again, then we'll worry about doing the hamburger menu, and then we'll worry about doing the images and things like that and getting it more responsive. But this will give us enough to do to get started. But I just wanted to show you where we're going first. This is kind of the intro. We won't start any code yet in this video, but just wanted to give you a little idea of where we're starting. So it's going to be EX5 Jumbotron responsive. We'll just call it Jumbotron.